Hello, I'm Libby Robin. I'm from Australia. I work there as an environmental historian in a university, the Australian National University, and in a museum, the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. I'm here in Berlin with a gang of most interesting people on an experiment called the Anthropocene campus. I'm one of the teachers in a fascinating set of questions about the Anthropocene, the idea that people are now influencing all the biophysical systems on Earth. This is an idea that's come out of geology, but I'm interested in using it as a metaphor for thinking in the humanities, because I'm a historian. I had a session called Slow Media, and we were looking at the idea of museums as places to think about the Anthropocene. And a museum is a bit different from a newspaper or other sorts of fast media, as we call them. It's a place where, like with slow food, you can digest ideas or look at objects and think about them, have a conversation with someone else about them. It's a place of real things and a place of big ideas. So we're trying to develop through this module, which will be a chapter in a course book and a supply of web materials, a way of teaching ideas about the Anthropocene. The group I was working with has done it entirely collectively and with a participatory framework, and we've decided we're going to have an imaginary museum of the Anthropocene, and slow media is all about listening. So we had to listen to each other, and the participants, who are an amazing group of well-qualified people, they're PhD students and some of them are postdocs and some of them are experienced artists. I think we had a lot of artists in our group who liked the idea of a relationship between an object and an idea. We had 12 artists, 4 designers, 9 scientists and 12 people who called themselves humanities, including some historians like myself, a philosopher or 2, and a few other sort of areas. So it was a really interesting group of people. And they're all doing different galleries for this imaginary museum. So I will do an orientation gallery, which was the part I did, but mostly I was a facilitator, and the idea for the museum itself came from the floor. So it's a very interesting project and a great way to learn a lot as well as so I'm not just a teacher, I'm a learner. Well, my present research, which I'm really just developing at the moment, is looking at the role for museums in the Anthropocene. So I'm interested in the intersection between university scholarship and public intellectual work. And the museum is a fabulous place to do public intellectual work and to meet all sorts of audiences. I've been a curator in the National Museum first. That was my first job in the 1990s when I was one of the people who... It was one of the first in the world to study the idea of people and the environment together, which of course is what the Anthropocene is all about. But we were more concerned with the sort of shorter timescales of people in the land in Australia in a national museum, which opened in 2001. When that job finished, I moved to the university and I worked in a school of, called the Fenner School of Environment and Society, which is in the College of Science. So I'm really a historian on the wrong side of the creek. We have a creek down the middle of the ANU, and on one side there are humanities and on the other side there are sciences, but I'm doing history on the wrong side of the creek. And within the Fenner School we have a variety of people doing all sorts of projects, and my students, I have a number of PhD students, they tend to come from somewhere else and want to do history, and they end up with a degree in interdisciplinary environmental studies. So I'm a historian, but not just a historian. My original training was in history of science, and my PhD was about a dispute in Victoria in which the idea of biodiversity became a political issue, and it was in 1969, so it was before we went green. It's quite an interesting period looking at the conservation movement before it became politically aligned with the left. In fact, many of the people, they came from everywhere. There were people who were, it was called the Little Desert Dispute, and there were people who came from the Communist Party, and they worked with people who came from the Melbourne Club, which was the most conservative club in Melbourne. And that was the way the conservation movement was when it came out of the Field Naturalist Club and the sort of people who just liked nature for fun. But it became much more political after the environmental revolution in the early 70s, and we had a Green Party. In fact, we had the first Green Party in the world in Tasmania, before the Germans even. And the second one was in New Zealand, and the Germans were about a year later. In 2005, Will Steffen came to the Fenner School of Environment and Society as our new director, and he was telling me about a project in history that was happening in Stockholm, where he'd just come from being director of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, IGBP. And the project he had in mind was an integrated history and future of people on Earth, I hope. And I said to him, so who are the historians you're working with? He said, oh, I don't think we know any historians. We're all modellers and people working in that sort of field. So we started a conversation, and we already had a very strong group of humanities in the ANU, where I was working, looking at what we called the ecological humanities. What could the humanities, history, philosophy, literature, do for the environment? And Will was interested in that, and we were interested in Will's project, and so we sort of started a conversation that really crossed the disciplinary boundaries. And Will and I wrote a paper together in 2007 about why we need history to understand world systems. They had been doing quite a lot of work on global history, and particularly on the idea of collapse, because sustainability's opposite is collapse. So they're looking at collapsed societies. But they tended to look at their societies in terms of information rather than context. And I think what we do with the humanities is provide the context for the information. And it's great fun to work together. The last page of our paper together, Will wrote a wonderful piece about how important history was. I didn't write that bit, he did. So it's one of those good conversations that turns into something else. So since 2011, I've been a guest professor at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, where I work in a division for the history of science, technology and environment. And in that group, we have really turned around we've got a mass of people who are interested in the ideas of the Anthropocene, of global change, of science and technology and what it does for the planet. And we're trying to put those ideas together in what we call an environmental humanities laboratory, which has been an extremely exciting thing to be part of. It started while I was there, and it's been something I've seen from the beginning, and it's been a very fruitful place. And about, I think, 6 of the participants here are from that lab, and 3 of the presenters. So it's really quite a well represented, as well as me, so four presenters. So there's quite a lot of people from the Royal Institute of Technology supporting this event, and we're a sponsor, if you like, of the Anthropocene Project's curriculum. Since I've been in Sweden, I've been working on a project called Expertise for the Future. One of the interesting aspects of the Anthropocene is how much of it is future-oriented. And when we think on the history of the future, it wasn't always scientists who were interested in futures. in the 15th century or 16th century, you'd go to a prophet if you wanted to know about the future. And maybe in the 19th century, you might read a novel. It was really not until the middle of the 20th century that scientists became the voice of the future. C.P. Snow once said, the scientists have the future in their bones. It's a sort of change of ideas, and it redefined the future into something that could be quantified, modelled, measured, all those things that we know dominate the Anthropocene discourse. And in the meantime, it's been quite hard for, I think, for history to speak to that discourse. And we've changed our direction, so we now are sort of being able to critique the idea of trust in numbers. There's a lovely book by Theodore Porter called Trust in Numbers, looking at why policy people want to have a statistic rather than a context for their information. But I think that the statistics are much richer if there is the context as well, and that's been something that's really changing, and the idea of the humanities being an equal partner and an agenda setter in the debates about global change has been quite important. And the Anthropocene works very well to describe a layer in the rock, the strata, but it also works even better, I think, as a metaphor for our global times. So with the Expertise for the Future project, Sverker Sörlin and Paul Ward, who is soon to be at Cambridge University, and I have produced two things. A book called The Future of Nature, Documents of Global Change, which looks at key works that gives us a history of ideas, of the big ideas in global change. The oldest one is the German work by von Carlowitz, which defines sustainability in 1713. And the latest one in the book was 2011, and it was a history of science document, and it was by Mike Hume, who was concerned not to reduce the future to climate. So the idea that it's not just climate that's changing, everything's changing, and that's what's stressful for people. The other book we're working on is called The Environment, A History. And one of the really surprising things is how late we thought of the environment, the idea that we could manage nature. And that's a post-war, 1948 sort of moment. In fact, the first chapter in the book is called 1948. And it has an arc which possibly comes to the end of the idea that we can manage nature at the point when people are inside nature and there isn't anything that isn't people. So the Anthropocene is the last chapter, and in between we look at ecology, governance, economics and other issues one by one, usually working our way forward from 1948 to 2000, when the idea of the Anthropocene was first mooted. The difference, I think, between the Anthropocene when defined by the ecological humanities and when it's defined by the geophysical stratosphere is that we start at the other end. And we look at the way people are in the environment rather than how the environment is shaped by people. So when you look at ideas like the biophysical systems and who's driving them, you look at how the system works, and then you say the person is the arrow, if you like. Well, we're really interested in what the Anthropocene is doing to the people. How are we thinking differently because we live in the Anthropocene? Do we see the world differently because we're doing it through screens? And there is all sorts of evidence of neural patterns that are changing because we use screens. We apparently shouldn't use them just before we go to bed at night because we don't sleep so well. There's a whole lot of actual physical changes in the way we're thinking. But conceptually, I think the other reason we don't want to reduce the future to numbers is that, for example, people who are concerned about climate change come up with numbers, and people who want to discredit them can contest the numbers. But if you start at the other end and you look at the people who might suffer from climate changes, and we did this with the people of the Pacific, and I'll come back to that, but if you start with the people who suffer rather than with the causes, then you get away from the blame game and you can actually have a conversation. So I think the humanities are really important to this debate, because it's clear that there are marketing forces, the merchants of doubt, who come in and take the facts from science and twist them and say, oh, but I don't believe that, and this little bit can be taken out of context and made to sound like it's the opposite. And then you get the fast media giving the 2 points of view equal time, even though 1% think this and 99% think that. So we have to get the debate onto a different footing, and that's one of the reasons I like this idea of slow media, because if you start talking with the people who suffer rather than with the people who cause, you don't have the same opposition. And we had a meeting in New York last year in October called Collecting the Future, where we were looking at what can a museum collect for a place that's actually possibly disappearing with climate change. And we started with the curator of the Pacific Museum in Samoa, who lost her little girl in a climate change affected tsunami. And one little 11-year-old girl, this little daughter of this mother, just had everybody focused in a way that endless statistics and graphs just can't do. The human side of the Anthropocene, I think, is the way to move forward and look at ways to talk across barriers. There are problems, huge problems, in transforming our energy use and our ways of doing things, but there is a reason to do it if you actually think of the little girl. That is nothing like a statistical reason. Because we know things with our heads, but we also know things with our hearts and with our hands. And I think that the best conversations you need all those skills for. And I think that the environmental humanities or the ecological humanities are engaging with passion, with concern, and in the case of the arts, with their hands, making things. And that product, the sort of making things together, the teams that make things, like the students here who have been doing beautiful artwork as part of their presentations, that's what makes the wholeness of the Anthropocene and the teams that build knowledge across disciplinary categories possible. I think the ecological humanities can be actively political and quite activist, and generally speaking the art movement leads that. Within the scholarly movement, I think that the role of scholarship in persuading policy is quite important, and it might be not activist in the sense of campaigning and picketing. It might be more changing hearts and minds. I think a good story can shift a debate, and a good image, a beautiful image, can move hearts. It doesn't have to make people go and say, I'm going to change the world, but it can be that changing the world can be done slowly from below or majorly from above, and we want to work at both levels. I think that we need to change the attitudes of people because they want to have them changed, not because we're preaching to them. I guess that's what I call the public intellectual, I guess. And a public intellectual persuades people because they believe it, not because they've been told they have to do it. The ecological humanities emerged in Australia about the same time as the Anthropocene, actually, at a time when I think Aboriginal people were taking over the idea of country and explaining it their way to the the settler society. And people have taken a very long time to find a common way of speaking about things between traditional Aboriginal management for country and I guess the usual Western ways. The ecology actually shapes the way farming works, the way business works, the way the government works. We've got a long history of failed farming, a long history of difficult attempts to, for example, develop the north of Australia, but we keep on thinking we're going to do it, and each time we start again as if we've never done it before. So you've got questions of land and land rights for Aboriginal people and questions of management for agriculture and for business models. One of the things that's really hard to understand in Australia is there are no regular seasons in much of the country. So the idea of 4 seasons, which comes from the European and North American worlds where we have all the markets, doesn't work in Australia. So you can go several years without getting a harvest, which makes it very hard to pay back the bank. Or you can get 2 harvests in 1 year. It's called boom and bust. And the cycles of booming and busting change the way business works in Australia. So suddenly the Aboriginal model of country, where country owns the person rather than the person owns the country, and the ideas of multiple seasons, most Aboriginal groups have at least 6 and sometimes 8 or 12 seasons in the year, give you a whole different way of thinking about managing life in Australia. And I think that's one of the reasons the ecological humanities got together, because the ecology was a little uncomfortable with the market system and economics of the West. And we called it ecological humanities because the idea of sustainability, which we adopted from Rio like everywhere else, was called the ecologically sustainable development in Australia, not just sustainability or sustainable development, but ESD. And it's in 150 pieces of our legislation as ecologically sustainable development. So it's a word that it means the scientific ecology, it doesn't mean the political one, and it means the relationship of people to land that is sensitive to the specifics of Australia. I think that's why it's come through. And perhaps also I think science is quite strong in Australia, or was until about 2000 anyway. And people know a lot about ecological change, and people had bushfires or major droughts or things in their lives to respond to personally. So there was a real reason to be human about the ecology. So people have a real reason in Australia to think about nature or ecology and humans together, and sometimes to have strong reactions to it. We've had some major bushfires and we've had several since that time. But the other thing, of course, now that climate change is aggravating this. We find these climate-driven disasters are more common, closer together, and so the reasons to be more attracted to environmental humanities have increased. We changed the name in 2010, I think it was, to environmental rather than ecological humanities, because the rest of the world was doing it too, and they called it environmental humanities, and we wanted to have a journal, and for it to be a global journal it was sensible to use the term. But I think in some ways when we want to be precise, we still would say ecological humanities. Well, I think it would be lovely to imagine the future in a way through the lens of the human rather than through the lens of numbers. So futures, I think, are about hearts and hands, perhaps even more than heads. And we're talking about different disciplines and different drives in the past. I think also the future, the Western idea of facing the future, of time's arrow going from the past to the future, is perhaps not the only way to think about the future. Aboriginal Australians face their ancestors, so the future is behind them. They think about things differently, and I think we need to have many possible futures, and really the most important thing is the long now, the idea that now could be 3 or 4 generations ahead and behind, and that sense of a larger now is probably more important than a future. There is certainly a great trap in saying there is no future, because then the reasons to care evaporate, and we need ways to care about the future and about our children's children's children and the quality of their lives, which is already undoubtedly will be more difficult with climate change, particularly where I come from in Australia, where there'll be things we know about bushfires, but there'll be things like heat stress which will make real problems for the most vulnerable communities in remote Australia, where it's very hot already. We had 53 degrees at Oodnadatta last year, and the summer after was even hotter. So they had to get a new colour on the map for the heat. And the people who live there are traditional Aboriginal communities with poor health and poor accommodation. They don't have air conditioning.